Hi, welcome everyone.
It's my fault. My bad. Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself.
No problem. Okay. Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Carr, and I'm Chief Knowledge Broker for Octo, Open Communications for the Ocean. For those of you who aren't familiar with Octo, we're an NGO that connects ocean professionals to the knowledge and networks they need through our webinar series and our MPA help, EBM help, and ocean plastic list communities. We also provide custom consulting services. So we're very excited to welcome today Laura Perry from Castlerock Conservation and the IUCN Social Services Committee Behavior Change Task Force. Laura is going to be speaking about changing human behavior to secure conservation outcomes, something we all need to know a lot more about. So just to give everyone an idea of how this is going to run, we'll first have Laura, she will present first, and then we'll move to Q&A. You can submit questions for the Q&A in two ways. You can post it in the Q&A section of the user interface, or you can post it in the chat. It'll be visible to everyone in the chat and other people if you have input on various questions or just other input related to the webinar topic. Feel free to post to everyone in the chat. We just ask that anything you post in the chat be on topic and professional. But anyway, you can send in the questions either way. Laura, thank you so much for being with us. We so appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to speaking to you all about my favorite topic, behavior change.
And we're done with the intro, so I'll just turn it over to you now.
So if I share that and then I do that, is that looking like it did before?
It looks great. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So wonderful to speak to you all today. And I'm quite pleased to be talking to people with an ocean focus. As somebody who spends a lot of time in oceans when I get the excuse to, I have a lot of interest in marine environments. And I think that it's a really important and underserved environment for behavior change. A lot of the work that we see is on terrestrial environments. And I think that given the nature of issues in the ocean, that's something that ought to change as we go through. So very short talk today. I can't talk you through all of it in 30 to 40 minutes, but what I hope to do is provide some resources and directions for people who want to explore more about how behavior change might be useful for you in your work. So to begin with, why does behavior change matter? I would certainly argue that virtually all of today's conservation issues are to do with human behavior, and that to resolve them, we need to change that behavior. Whether you're thinking about discarded fishing gear or overconsumption of particular species, in particular predators, of course, or even through to something as big in scale as climate change and bleaching, all of our conservation goals are really to do with anthropogenic threats. And therefore, it's very difficult to see how they can be improved without thinking about how people behave. So to do that, we need to understand people, we need to work with communities and set up systems for long-lasting, sustainable change. But how do we do that? So before I get into the meaty, interesting bit, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on myself and how I came to have expertise in this emerging field. So like a lot of people in the human dimensions of wildlife, my formative years in conservation were with biology as my background. So I did biology as an undergrad at Oxford, and through that time, I got very involved with wild crew, which may not mean very much to the marine people, but in the world of big mammalian carnivores, that's the research group. So I had so many senior academics that I was surrounded by who were developing and implementing amazing technical solutions to human wildlife conflict. But unfortunately, quite often what you would see is a great mitigation solution that people didn't like or people didn't implement, so it didn't quite work, which kind of led me to the question of, okay, how do we work with communities to encourage them to use these solutions and actually have these win-win situations where human wildlife conflict is mitigated? So that's the kind of underlying question for my PhD, which was focusing on human wildlife conflict and livestock management behavior in East Africa. Because there's a lot of things that people can do to reduce conflict, but exploring what motivates people, what encourages people, why people change their behavior or don't change their behavior was kind of, I thought, quite a key question. So following on from that, I was then doing a postdoc in Mozambique and again, working with communities to understand the factors that did lead to change and the factors that didn't lead to change in terms of applied intervention design. So through the kind of undergrad, PhD, postdoc, it was all very hands-on applied behavior change in the real world. But towards the end of my postdoc, I started to realize that this wasn't just a problem for individual projects. This was a huge problem across conservation, that very few conservationists were really thinking about how to work with people and thinking about how to change human behavior. So at that point, I moved to a role with the IUCN Species Survival Commissions. That was based at the Global Center at Indianapolis Zoo. And I was working with it's increased since then, but about 168, 170 specialist groups to try and encourage them to incorporate behavior change into their conservation activities. And it was really interesting to see across this community of global, internationally renowned experts how nascent some of the social sciences were, how little thought had been paid to, okay, what's the human psychology? What's the behavioral science? How do we work with people? So that was a really interesting role. I was there for a while. And then end of 2023, I decided that I would quite like to be able to choose which partner organizations I worked with, my own setup. So I moved back to Europe and started my own sort of independent organization, which focuses on behavior change. It does a few other things, but mostly behavior change. And I remain heavily involved in the behavior change task force, which was set up while I was at with the IUCN, and that is an ongoing resource for behavior change within this world. So I'll come back to that later. And just to give you a little bit of an overview, these are the countries in which I either currently have a project or have a project that is in the latter stages of development. So particularly, I'm interested in the global south because of sort of my expertise and working with small in situ projects in a lot of Eastern and Southern Africa. But as you can see, I've got quite a range of different partners. And I think it just goes to show how behavior change is needed no matter where you are, whether it's the US or Indonesia or Madagascar. There are approaches to working with people that are so important for conservation practice around the world. So I'll just pull out a few examples to highlight different types of work where behavior change is relevant, but there are a lot more I could talk about. So let's start off in the US. Big local NGO in Florida got in touch to say, look, we're having an issue. There are pythons in the Everglades, as I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the invasive species problems there. And we need the public to phone in whenever they see a python. So this whole campaign is trying to understand what the public thinks when they see pythons, how we can motivate them to actually call the NGO and make sure that the pythons are removed when they're encountered. So a big kind of citizen science push to get people engaged with conservation work and helping conservation NGOs to carry out their work. Second example, and I'll go into this one more later, so I won't touch on too much of it now, but is working to reduce illegal pet trade in Barbary macaques in Morocco. So again, a very applied situation where there's a specific problem that everyone's aware of that is very focused on a human behavior and trying to reduce the incidence of that behavior. In South America, I'm quite involved with Yakupacha, and we've been working through a couple of different examples, but basically working with communities of experts who do not come from a human dimensions background, but who have been working on cetacean conservation for decades. And have said, look, we've been doing stuff with people, but it's very hard for us to understand what's been effective, what hasn't been effective, and how we can improve these programs. So effectively, a review exercise to help bring some of these practitioners in line with a modern understanding of human dimensions of conservation and how behavioral approaches can be used to improve and strengthen those programs for nearshore cetaceans. The next example I wanted to pull out is in Kenya and Tanzania, where I've been helping to support the design and implementation of efforts to reduce the persecution of raptors. So some species of birds of prey communities don't like. So unpicking that and understanding the mechanisms by which you can encourage communities to behave slightly differently and therefore not shoot or kill raptors is the program there. In Madagascar, we're focusing on something similar, but motivated for different reasons. So people often kill and eat lemurs where they're very insecure for protein sources. So developing livelihoods programs which help people to move from a difficult to catch protein source like lemurs to one that's much more sustainable, much more consistent, much more useful like chickens. And then in Japan, I helped a group to develop their skills surrounding understanding stakeholders and setting up for behavior change interventions. So I do quite a lot of trainings alongside this, but I think that for most people, most of the time, training is a great place to start, but you often also need someone with more expertise in the design and implementation to provide a little bit of advice as you go through the process. Because I see quite a lot of interventions that have been done by people with really strong biological sciences backgrounds, but where you can tell that there are things that were missed or not done to the fullest extent possible because they didn't have enough social science or behavior change specific input. So all of that's great, but what do I actually mean by behavior change? So I think we all know what it means to change our behavior, right? So not using a plastic straw or choosing a healthy lunch, for example. But when I say behavior change, I mean specifically the scientific discipline of behavior change. So using social psychology, marketing, behavioral economics, all those very evidence-based levers to encourage people to change from a behavior we don't want to a behavior that we do want. And I think it's really important to emphasize to the scientific community, so to you, that this isn't some soft and squishy discipline, right? Behavior economics, psychology, all of these fields on which behavior change is based are very evidence-based. I particularly draw a lot on healthcare and healthcare interventions. And again, these are huge data-led studies that are a very data-led scientific process. I think there's a little bit of a fear in some conservation scientists that human dimensions and behavior change can be a little bit fuzzy around the edges and imprecise. But I would encourage you to not think that way and to understand that there's a huge amount of science, research, evidence-led design that goes into this field. So I would say that an awful lot of interventions that will impact everyone's day-to-day lives are to do with behavior change. You just might not think of it like that. So for example, thinking of the changes in smoking habits over the past 20 years, or seatbelt use, right? Something that used to be uncommon, but has been promoted heavily through legislation, through marketing, through a range of mechanisms, all of which are behavioral change. And then even something as small as recent changes to how meals or foodstuffs are labeled in supermarkets, right? All of that is behavior change using different mechanisms. And I think that conservation has been quite slow to make the most of this field and implement it where it needs to be implemented. So what does behavior change actually involve then? I'm going to return to each of the steps here in a few minutes, but I wanted to run you through a very brief overview of the different steps that are involved in a behavior change campaign. So first, like all good science, you need a theory, you need a model to understand how you think behavior is formed and how you think behavior is changed. I'll come back to the different models you might choose to use in a few minutes, but I do really want to emphasize that it is important to have a foundational theory that your work is built on. You wouldn't approach an ecological predator-prey dynamic without a theory. You wouldn't approach most biological problems without some sense of kind of an explanation that you can falsify or test. And I think it's really important that we bring that same level of scientific rigor to behavior change and human dimensions. So after your theory, then you need to go into design. And this is the fun bit, right? This is where you get to use all of your different disciplines, all the different tools and tricks to design something that might work in your situation. Then you get to implementation. So I would always expect a program to have adaptive management and a design to change on implementation. But nevertheless, at a certain point, you just have to do something and see if it works. And then evaluation. Again, I'll come back to this, and I've only pulled it out as the last stage because that ultimately is where you end up with the question of did it work? But evaluation is baked into all the elements of a good behavior change program. From your design through your implementation, you should be able to understand if it's working, and if so, how. So let's go through these stages in a little bit more detail. So there are a lot of theories of behavior, dozens, maybe hundreds, and lots of them are not appropriate for conservation, right? There are a lot of models that are used in clinical psychology where you're sitting with a therapist. Clearly, those are not appropriate for in situ field interventions. But equally, there are lots of interventions that are appropriate and that we can draw from. If you look back through the conservation literature, most of the behavior change manuscripts publications you'll see from the past 20 years use the theory of planned behavior to explain why people do what they do. This gives that attitudes, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control lead to intention, which then in turn leads to behavior. So I think we all have quite an intuitive understanding of what an attitude is, subjective norms being the things that we see people doing around us, and then perceived behavioral control being something like, can I do this? What's stopping me from doing it? Do I feel like I'm able to do the behavior? So TPB is a great model. It's very useful some of the time. But more recently, you'll see a lot more practitioners move across to COM-B, as this model is called, which gives that capability, opportunity, and motivation lead to behavior. Now, personally, I quite like COM-B because I think it is more flexible, it's more adaptive, and you've got more opportunities to build in everything that you need to about the social and ecological context. And here, motivation is what you think it is. It's important to point out capability is kind of your internal resources. Do you have the knowledge? Do you have the physical capacity to do something? Whereas opportunity can be thought of more as your social resources, right? Is there the infrastructure in place? Do people in your community want you to carry out a behavior? What do all these external factors look like? So to me, COM-B is a great starting point to think about why people are behaving in particular ways. Now, once you have got your framework for behavior, then you can move through into designing the intervention. And there are a couple of stages here, and I know that some of these stages will be what you really wanted me to talk you through on this call, but I would argue that doing a 2-minute piece on behavior change mechanisms is going to be unsatisfying for you, and it won't actually help you to apply them. So I'll show you some resources to get more into the details of that shortly. But first, stage 1, background information. It is so important to get as much information as you can about human communities, about the behavior in question, about the problem that that behavior causes from a conservation perspective prior to designing the intervention. I think personally that it's quite important to have both qualitative and quantitative information in this kind of information gathering stage, and the richer the better. So from my perspective, this usually means carrying out focus groups, thinking about the different audiences who are involved in the behavior or the problem, and trying to understand from the community or communities' perspective why this is happening. I think with behavior change, it's very important to remember that you are working with people, and people don't generally do something for no reason, right? So bringing empathy and understanding and trying to build those relationships at the start is a really important part of this process. So this is a photograph of me in Kenya consulting with a women's beading group about some particular mechanisms for improving livelihoods in that area. But it could be done in any number of different ways. But the important point is that it is done, and it is done sensibly and with meaningful engagement. Step 2, I would say, is thinking about your overall strategy. So everybody always wants to get to the next step, which is looking at behavior change mechanisms and getting into the minutiae of the design. But I think that spending time first looking at the overall strategy is really important. So how does an intervention fit within your work? What happens if you change the behavior that you're planning on changing? How does that impact the rest of the project? So it's important to have kind of joined up thinking about, if this happens, then what happens? What are the risks? What are the knock-on effects of a behavior changing? And I think this is really important to understand what the unintended consequences would be, and also whether you were talking about the right issue. And it would surprise you how often I work with a partner, and after you've done the research and talked about the plan, it becomes obvious that the thing that they were worried about is not the thing that will have most impact on the conservation problem. And actually, they need to be thinking about something entirely different. So then you think about your behavior change mechanisms. So this is where you're talking about different tools that can be used to change people's behavior. So there are different resources that you can use to select different tools, and we might look at the behavior change wheel, which is a really useful resource, or intervention mapping toolkit. But there are a range of different tools that can help you identify different mechanisms. And there's a wealth of literature in healthcare and social psychology on the impact of different tools and comparisons and meta-analyses and all of that data from which to draw. But I would say there are a couple of main types of intervention. So you're looking at things like social marketing, persuasion, working with people to help them feel a certain way about something. You can think about incentives or punishment, right? What are the penalties or rewards for doing things? And then changes to the social or physical context, right? How does a community feel about something? Can we change that? Or what are the real physical barriers to somebody doing something? And is there a way to make that easier or more difficult? So think recycling bins versus no recycling bins, right? Certain physical properties make things much easier or much more difficult. There are so many resources here that I get that design can be daunting, but I would strongly recommend not doing design on your own unless you've done it before, because it is precise. It is something where you want a reasonable amount of expertise. And there is a growing number of conservation practitioners with this expertise, but I would still say it's a very small field. So it's great for more people to gain those skills. That's absolutely wonderful. But much like you wouldn't expect a social scientists to just do the ecology on the side, it's really not reasonable to expect an ecologist to just figure out behavior change on the side. I would say it takes time and effort to acquire those skills. The next thing, once you've got your intervention strategy, is design the materials. So this could be physical materials, it could be digital materials, it could be anything from a bear-resistant trash can to a poster, right? But once you've got the strategy, only then should you start to think about those materials. And everybody always wants to skip through to this stage, but you cannot do it well unless you've done 1, 2, and 3 first. And then ensuring that you spend an adequate amount of time testing those materials and making sure they do what you think they do is pretty important. I'll say it now and I'll say it again, but behavior change is unusual insofar as it can make a problem worse. So you have to make sure you are understanding what you're doing and the impacts that it's having. So we've talked about the stages, right, through theory, design, implementation to evaluation. And we've talked about how evaluation should be baked in to all of those different stages. But again, this is a very technical skill to design a suitable evaluation program. And I, again, can't teach you that in 20 minutes. But what I can do is suggest some questions that are useful to think about when you're designing your monitoring and evaluation plan. So, first of all, what are the long-term goals of the intervention, right? Those should be articulated clearly in your plan. And it's good to ensure that you are measuring those and not just shorter-term proxies. You really do need to be able to understand if you're achieving those long-term goals. But at the same time, it's also meaningful to think about intermediate outcomes, right? What needs to happen for those goals to be reached eventually? And making sure that you're measuring any of those key intermediate outcomes is pretty important to have a cohesive plan. It's also worth thinking about for any of these questions, whether the information is likely to be sensitive, right? Will people feel uncomfortable talking to you about it? Is there likely to be social stigma associated with the results? Because that will lead you to different approaches for understanding the problem. You might have to use different techniques to get at sensitive information. Obviously, behavior change has to be collaborative if it's going to work. So ensuring that communities, the partners that you are working with are going to be heard throughout the process, because they're the ones who will notice first if something's not working or if it's having unintended consequences. So making sure that any monitoring and evaluation process has good levels of feedback built up into it is pretty important. And then I also like to make sure that I have lots of parallel sources to assess the same thing. So maybe you have one strand of information that is a closed-ended survey, but maybe at the same time you have some focus groups that are getting at the same question through different approaches. Just allows you to cross-reference and validate your information, which I think is particularly important with social studies. And then I also want to point out that monitoring is not the same as evaluation. Monitoring is what happens when you measure stuff on an ongoing basis, and evaluation is what happens when you measure stuff at certain fixed points, so maybe halfway through a grant cycle or at the end of a project. Behavior change interventions, I'll say again, can go wrong, right? Your intervention can have unintended consequences, and I also see interventions that actively make the problem worse because, for example, people have used social norms wrong. So instead of discouraging a behavior, it actually encourages it. So it's really important with behavior change that you're not just doing end of project evaluations, but that you are monitoring continuously so you can detect it if your intervention is having the wrong outcomes, right? You need to be able to see that in real time and adapt. So designing a thoughtful M&E plan is pretty important, I would say, for this. Now, just really quickly, I want to run through 3 examples that I think are illustrative of why behavior change can be useful and how it can be integrated into a proper in situ conservation project. So I mentioned this program before. This is working with Barbary Macaque Awareness and Conservation, which is a local NGO in Morocco. And the point I want to highlight here is that it's really important to understand who we're talking about. So the problem is people have macaques as pets. This is illegal, it's very bad for macaques, and it leads to unsustainable trade within Morocco. The project suspected that the people who wanted macaques were young men. And that's what we see from purchasing behavior data, even if it's very tentative. But that's not the whole story. So this program, it really illustrates how important it is to segment your audiences. Because as we've gone through the process of talking to people about macaques and purchasing decisions and why people have them at home, we've realized that it's not the young men that are influencing the household decisions, it's the women. So women are the head of household in terms of many of those home decisions. And if you've got a white sofa or if you've got, a really beautiful home, macaques are quite smelly. Macaques are not a nice thing to have. So for the sort of upper middle class Moroccan audience who are buying these animals, it's far more useful to message that it's going to make your home smelly. It's not a clean pet to have around the place than it is to try and dissuade young men, because ultimately, mum or the wife is in charge of this decision. So, very important to identify the right group to target in any intervention, because if you message to the wrong group or you design an intervention for the wrong group, you won't see the outcomes you want to see. So, key takeaway, thinking about the behavior and who has influence over it, because it's not necessarily who you think. Second example is a project that's drawing to a close now that I'm quite excited to finish out, and there should be some nice research publications coming out from this in the coming months. So this is what I want to talk about. You'll see this a lot in East Africa, where communities live alongside dangerous wildlife, like lions, like hyena. And those predators often come in and kill livestock. So people in those communities often then put poison on a carcass, right? If your cow has been killed, you put poison on the carcass. So if a lion comes back, then the lion's killed by the poison. But that means that lots of vultures are also killed, and this is having devastating consequences on ecosystems in East Africa. So we've been exploring different opportunities, different ways to dissuade people from carrying out this behavior. And it became apparent pretty early on that the way to do it is not to talk about predators. It's not to talk about vultures. It's not to talk about wildlife at all. It's to think about communities, because pesticides are really harmful for human health. Pesticides are used as poison. So focusing all of the messaging around the human health ramifications has been key to this campaign, because that's what really means something to those people. They don't care if a lion gets killed. They don't really care if a vulture gets killed. But if a dog or a child is hurt, that has far more serious ramifications. So thinking about what's meaningful to your target audience and why should they want to change behavior, right? Because if people don't want to change, they won't. So understanding those areas of overlap where what you want and what they want line up is really important to designing a thoughtful and mutually beneficial campaign. The last one I want to talk about is how livelihoods should be thought about alongside behavior change. And alongside the Behaviour Change Task Force, I'm also a member of SULI's Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Specialist Group, because I think livelihoods are key. I think it's not appropriate a lot of the time to design behaviour change interventions that just encourage people to do something. Well, quite a lot of the world, and particularly in the global south, people have very few options to behave in sustainable ways. So helping them to make that decision and reinforcing it with meaningful structural change that supports sustainable choices is pretty important, I think. So the third project I wanted to discuss is in development, but it's looking at fishing communities in West Africa, and particularly Ghana, where unfortunately a lot of this happens. So fishermen are deliberately slaughtering turtles off the coast or when they come up on beaches to lay, and that meat is being sold for consumption. It's not sold into cities, but it's consumed locally. And this is obviously terrible for sea turtle conservation, but it's also pretty bad for communities, right? It transpires that this is not anybody's first choice of meat. It's just that there aren't any fish any longer because of big international fishing fleets off the coast of West Africa, because of sustained pressures on those fisheries. The catches are getting smaller and smaller, and a lot of these coastal communities have no means of managing their catch effectively and making sure that their income sustains them throughout the year. So even if you have fish 6 months of the year, you don't have fish the rest of the year, and that can be quite difficult in terms of protein. So through talking to these communities, it became obvious that people don't really want to eat turtles. People really want to eat fish. And what would be really helpful is the ability to process fish, or to have cold storage, or to have some form of factory locally that means that catch and therefore income and also protein sources are not so seasonal or fluctuating depending on different catch rates. So in this case, it's really important to come up with not just an emotive campaign, not just something that focuses on motivation, but something that really creates the structural ability for people to behave in suitable ways. So thinking about the barriers for your audience and why they're not doing something and what could help them to do something is really important for fair and equitable behavior change. So that's a lot of information in a very short amount of time. Um, and I would say that there's so much more to go into. Conservation behavior change is a very small field, but it's one that's growing rapidly. And it's really exciting as a practitioner in this to see more and more people taking an interest in conservation behavior change. However, a lot of the literature that has been published runs very, very academic, and that's great, but it may not always be the most useful resource for practitioners. So there are some people out there who do, there's not very much, but there are some trainings out there. So you might want to look up Brooke Tully. She does a great course on behavior change. They can be a little bit expensive, a lot of the trainings. So I have two courses that I've set up in collaboration with Octo, focusing on behavior change for marine practitioners. So a very limited number of spaces. So I think there won't be more than 30 people on each of those two trainings, because the point is to work you through exercises so you actually develop some skills to approach a problem on your own. So one of them is designed for people in Europe and further east, and one of them is designed for people in the Americas in terms of the time zones. And that link should take you through to sign up if you're interested. And just as an extra thing, because what interests me most is not necessarily training for the sake of training, but training so that people can go away and implement stuff. So if you participate in one of those courses and you would like to, I'd be happy to offer people an individual half-an-hour conversation to talk about moving forwards and implementing or figuring out the next steps to integrate behavior change into their work. So yeah, if people want to, I'd be happy to do that as a follow-on from the course. So there are other resources as well, all of which are good places to start. So Behavior Change Task Force, we have some great publications out. There's a needs assessment. There are a range of other products, which will be really useful resources for people who are looking at this field. But if you go away and read one thing, read this thing. So it's a review paper exploring how behavior change has been used across conservation. More than anything, it shows where the gaps are. And there's some pretty big gaps, but I think it's a good scoping exercise to show you what has been done and where the greatest needs are. I think that the resources that Traffic has on their website are also pretty useful, pretty good introductions to thinking about audiences, thinking about different messengers. But again, that's only if messaging is an appropriate tool, and it isn't always. And then Rare, of course, has a huge amount of expertise in behavior change and some very useful resources on their website. So lots of exciting things. And when some of those publications that I mentioned come out, they'll also go on my website, and there'll be free resources for people who want to read more about this, because I think this is really important, right? I think conservation practitioners are realizing that you can't solve problems without behavior change. So it's really important for us as a community of practice, as people who want to help, to figure out how to work with people so that people and wildlife see good outcomes. And a lot of that will mean working to design effective, sustainable behavior change. So that's all from me. And I've just reiterated the QR code in case anybody's interested in those trainings. And that's everything. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be very happy to take those.
Laura, thank you so much. This was fabulous. Um, it's a great, very clear introduction, and as everyone can see, there'll be some more detailed trainings available. Um, you can get the more information from the QR code, and there's links in the chat. Okay, so a couple housekeeping items before we move to the Q&A. Is it possible to share the slides after the webinar?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That's fine.
Okay. Okay, so everyone, I'll post those alongside the recording on the recording page, and we'll send out a link to that page in a follow-up email alongside the various resources that have been posted by others in the chat and the information about the trainings. Okay, so great. Lori, yeah, again, so good. And let's see, we do have some questions for starting off. Um, One that came in early was, how do time horizon and lag in evidence impact ability to report change in a timely manner?
Yeah, that's why I don't have more publications on my website at the moment, because it takes time, right? And that is the issue. So I think you will see far and far more publications that are relevant coming out in a few years, because I would say it takes 2 years to really design, implement, and move through at the very least. So the vulture work that I mentioned in Tanzania, I'm really excited by that because we're seeing some preliminary and small, but some community-wide effects as a result of the trainings after only 2 years. And to me, that's a really short timeline if you're talking about social science. So yes, absolutely, it's a challenge, but as long as you assume that there is a lag and just be patient with it, more and more evidence will come out, but it's not a quick field, definitely.
Great, thank you. Um, Another question that came in my work, I'm often trying to figure out how I can develop community co-developed projects and to shift power dynamics from researcher to the researched. Do you have
Yes.
any experience in or specific advice for blending this work with community-led projects?
Yeah, so I think it's absolutely key to work with communities to design behavior change, because it needs to be fair. And I think there's a danger of imposing things if it's not done with sufficient consultation. So I completely agree with that point. For me, the biggest thing that I would say that conservation projects struggle with co-design is actual co-design, right? You have to be open to changing what you want to do. You have to be open to listening to what the community wants and not just what you want. And I find that a lot of projects want to say they went through co-design, but aren't willing to move away from the goals or metrics that they have. So I would always rather see a project take longer, meaningfully engage with the community, and perhaps even do some stuff that they don't want to do as a starting point for building trust, building relationships where you can get to a place of meaningfully working towards the same overall solutions. So I would say it's worth digging deep and exploring to what extent you are actually willing to co-design and sacrifice some of your short-term objectives for the long term of designing things together, but that it's always worth doing as long as you can, right? And it doesn't have to mean engaging with everybody in a community all of the time, right? It can mean working with specific segments to achieve something, or it can mean discussing things at a high level with community chiefs to understand where your objectives align with theirs. But I think meaningfully compromising is an important part of co-design that a lot of conservationists need to do better.
Okay, thank you, Laura. A question, how long does a typical engagement take?
It depends on the project. I know that's a really unsatisfying answer, but it really depends what you're trying to do. So I would say when I'm involved with a project, what I normally do is we spend a long, well, not even a long time, as much time and it's is reasonable relative to the size of the project and the complexity of the issue, gathering information. Then the work relationship goes through kind of a peak where you spend a lot of time designing and testing. And then these projects have a very, very long tail, because what you don't want is to say, okay, thank you very much, goodbye, I hope it goes well, right? You need to provide the long-term support for 2 years, 3 years, so that a project can adapt and work with the results to improve the outcomes. So I would say your scoping and design could be 6 months or less, right? If you're intending to hit it really hard initially, it could be 6 months or less to get background and design done. But then there needs to always be that very long kind of development, adaptation, change if needed, feedback to get the thing to work the way that you wanted it to. So 2 years before you're seeing good results, I would say, is a good litmus test.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. Let's see. So many good questions. We'll start with this one. As an environmental economist, my experience is that most damaging behavior has an economic basis. Do you agree that demand for wild resources is primarily market driven and that demand is easier to address than supply? If so, how would you approach for example, pangolin markets?
Mm. Yeah, so I think when you look at illegal wildlife trade, that is certainly true, but a lot of the issues the natural world is facing are not necessarily demand driven, or not in the way that you think about with trade, right? So, for example, in Madagascar, we'll see that local communities cut rainforest because they need firewood for their stoves, right? That's demand, but that's demand that's actually quite easy to address. It's not demand that is as complex as thinking about trade dynamics. I think for your ultra high worth natural resources like ivory, like pangolin scales, yeah, ultimately it has to come from demand because of global inequality. So you're never going to see supply sufficiently disincentivized compared to the amount that a pangolin or an ivory sale is worth. But I think that for most conservation issues, most of the time, that's I do think that's probably quite a minority of issues. And then coming back to the bigger picture question, is most of this economic? So insofar as the global south is poorer than, the West and extremely weird, well economically developed countries, then yes. But I don't know whether it's helpful to think about it like that, unless you're planning on resolving that, which I don't think we are, because that's not really within our scope of work, right? I think economic solutions are part of a solution, but they're not necessarily all of it. So, for example, yes, providing startup funds for a chicken vaccination program so that people can keep chickens rather than eating lemurs could absolutely be viewed through an economic lens. But at the same time, you could also view it through a lens of multiple different strategies that need to come together, which are very much within the normal remit of conservation community practice. So you could absolutely view all of this through an economic lens, but whether it adds anything is a different question. And it might do if you're an economist, but for most projects, most of the time, I don't know whether it does.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Laura. Um, let's see. There's another question. We have statutory and voluntary measures we could use to manage marine recreation in MPAs. They have a project just starting. Are there
Okay.
any studies about which approach is the most effective for behavior change and or the
It
time
will
scales?
depend. It
Okay.
will totally depend on the specific situation. It will depend on the audiences. It will depend on the reasons for compliance or non-compliance. It will depend on the part of the world that you're in. So things like that is where I think working with someone actually has merits, or like has significant merits, because even if you went out and found some studies, you would have to know from a behavior change perspective which bits of that are relevant. So I don't think you'll find anything on that. I would be very surprised if you did, but it will definitely be context specific. So it won't necessarily help you, even if you could find it.
All right. And did you have any comment just sort of about scales? And again, is that just purely context driven? Um,
So, yeah, if you have three different groups, right, and you can work clearly with each of those three different audiences to understand the problem and design something and implement it, that's one thing. If there are 20 different groups, some of which are dependent on these MPAs for livelihoods, and that it really depends how complex the needs are, how many groups you're working with, how the government structure works, because some countries obviously will be better able to enforce protections than others. So I think it's impossible to say without knowing the specifics.
all right. Thank you, Laura. Another question I wanted to ask, let's see, many of these projects likely exceed the funding timelines. How do you work with funders and funding sources when needing to invest the time in the design through evaluation stages?
Yeah, I think funders have not quite cottoned on to behavior change yet. It's not really a lot of funding setups are not designed for this. I completely agree with the question. I think they will have to be. And I think we are seeing more funders that get it to an extent, right, but which still don't have the long-term timelines. So what I would say is this is where the strength of your M&E plan comes in, because whilst you might not be able to say, we have completely changed this community's relationship with turtles in Ghana over 3 years, you might be able to say, well, people have more sources of protein security, people are less dependent on fishing or turtles for their livelihoods. The social norm around eating turtles has decreased in that time. So you can show things that are indicative that won't necessarily add up to a whole single outcome that you want to see, but you can certainly see meaningful change in a 3-year funding timeline. And I think a lot of indicators that are standardized, for example, if you look at the Darwin grants, are not set up for this yet, but I've seen more interest and more interest from funders in bringing those human dimensions in and doing it better. So I'm optimistic that those standardized indicators, where they exist, will improve over time for the big funders.
Okay, great. That's helpful, and hopefully the change will come there. Okay, another question. As you pointed out, structural changes are often needed to facilitate behavior change. However, the cooperation of policymakers is usually necessary to implement these structural changes. What successes and challenges have you had dealing with policymakers? And what tips do you have for others trying to affect behavior change through infrastructure, which requires policy change?
So I have less experience with policy, absolutely. Or if I have worked with policymakers, it tends to be local. So city councils who are emancipated to make smaller scale changes rather than national governments. Although I will say there are a lot of governments have an interest in behavioral science. If you think about healthcare, if you think about public safety measures, so it's not unusual for policymakers to speak this language more than they speak conservation. So again, it would depend upon the situation, but I think that a lot of the approaches I would talk about here will be quite familiar to policymakers, because the same as with wearing your seatbelts or the same as with recycling bins, right? These are structures and processes that you can go through. The governments generally, it's not new to them, even if it's new to us.
Okay, great. Thank you, Laura. Um, this is an interesting question. I presume that you can also use social media for gathering data. What are some of the challenges involved in this? I was wondering if you had any
Yeah,
experience in
I
this.
struggle with social media a little bit because it depends on a really clear understanding of your audience to get good data, right? So because your analytics will be partitioned out so much, you definitely have to know who you're trying to target. So you have to have good knowledge of the audiences to make that work. It also makes any control group much more difficult because the information is just sort of out there. Whereas with an in-person test, you're much more in control of who accesses the information, who doesn't. So I'm not averse to it, but I think it requires really, really careful thought as to what exactly you're testing and how you're testing it. And the ability to substantiate why a metric matters. So I see a lot of projects where the number of likes or the number of views is a measure of something, or it's built into their M&E as a success. But why? Right? Just viewing something or liking something tells you very little. So you could absolutely design a data collection protocol which includes some digital content, but making sure that you don't overstep the relevance of that content is pretty important, I would say. And an awful lot of good information that just because people have said something or seen something or liked something online, that doesn't mean anything tangible in the real world because digital content is very throwaway. So making sure that we're very aware of that is really important for using that data.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. Um, any advice for someone who wanted to move out of being a conservation practitioner and into a role more like your own?
Yeah. So I would still call myself a conservation practitioner, just for reference. I would say that I definitely am a conservation practitioner, but not with one individual project. Um, I think it's really useful to come from a place of conservation because you need to speak the language of the projects that you're working with. So having a conservation background is always useful. I have friends and colleagues who have come from different disciplines, and there's more of a trust need so that practitioners buy into them as an expert and feel like they understand the field. So I think coming from a place of conservation is always a good place to start with this. Um, and then it's hard at the moment with behavior change because there's not very much in terms of training or good resources. I would like to see, and we will see over the next few years, more people going through masters and PhD programs that equip them with the skills to do this. But I would say that there's nothing that compares to hands-on experience for doing this. So through my PhD and postdoc and some side work that I did along the way, I was very fortunate to get to see a lot of different projects and work in a lot of different environments, which is why I'm very lucky to be in the position where I've got that expertise from different places and different realms and different groups of people. So I guess if there was one thing that I would say to take away early in your career is saying yes to stuff, because the more deep your conservation experience is across the board, the more useful you will be if you want to get into something that is niche and human dimensions focused and where you work with lots of different projects because you're able to see patterns across different sites and generalize some of that expertise. But yeah, it's just putting in the time to get the familiarity with the specific subdiscipline. And yeah, it definitely makes a difference to have done the PhD, to have done a master's, because otherwise it's very hard for practitioners to understand why you're an authority on something. So pursue those qualifications, get involved with a range of things, and really have a strong sense of what it is that you're interested in. Because if you're not, and you get a few years down the line, it will be obvious to people that it's not your, and I hate the word passion, but you have to really care about these specific subdisciplines, particularly on the human dimensions side, because people can tell if you don't want to work with them, I think.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate that. Let's see. We have at least one more question. Let's see. The tragedy of the commons applies in the marine environment, for instance, in curbing overfishing. You may
Yeah.
want to succeed in changing a fishing community's behavior, but there's always one or more person who takes advantage of the new situation, the free rider phenomenon, and affects the overall success of the program. How would you address this problem in your attempts to change behavior?
Yeah, so I think that's where communities themselves play a really important role in policing. So this comes back to your co-design and making sure that systems are set up to allow communities to police themselves, right? So I've seen really great projects where a community gets a benefit if certain conservation metrics are reached, but they lose out on that metric if one person or a few people spoil it for them. And you'll know yourselves from your own communities how bad it feels for people to be cross with you, or how bad it feels for your neighbors to not like or not approve of something that you did. So I find that social norms, um, all of that sort of normative landscape within a community is a really powerful tool for changing behavior. Because if your neighbors think you're a terrible person for having done something, that's a very, we're social beings, that's a very compelling reason not to do it. So I absolutely accept that the tragedy of a commons is a big issue for marine environments. It's a big issue for a lot of terrestrial environments too. But I think that, yeah, as I said, where something is really strongly co-designed, where the community has bought into an outcome, making it's almost not your job to police it any longer. That becomes something where the community has to manage that themselves. And it won't work all of the time, particularly where communities are very varied or very itinerant. That's absolutely harder to change. And it maybe needs to be reinforced with other mechanisms like better punishment, better law enforcement. But at the same time, if a community can manage something like that themselves, that's the best outcome from my perspective.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Um, maybe so we're out of time. Unfortunately, we're not able to get to all the questions, and there's some really great questions remain. But I would encourage everyone to check out the extended trainings that'll be available in the coming months. And just to reiterate to everyone, we will be sending out an email to everyone who attended and those who registered but weren't able to attend. And we'll include information on where the recording from today is. It'll have a link to the slides, all the extra resources that were mentioned in the chat, and information about the trainings. So Laura, thank you again. We so appreciate you being here to present all this today. I mean, it's such a critical part of conservation. And I, we hope that many of the people here, those who are maybe interested in focusing on this area in the future will also get involved, because we can use so many more practitioners who are expert in this area. So thank you again for sharing all this, Laura.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. And if anyone has a burning question that we didn't get to, my email address is on my website. So you'd be more than welcome to send me an email and I can get back to your specific question if we didn't have time to go through it. So, yeah, thank you all for being here. It was fun to talk to you.
Okay. And thank you everyone for being here, and you'll look for a follow-up email from us. All right. Thanks again.